Welcome to another deep dive. And today we are diving headfirst into the world of Karl Marx,
Right.
a name that I think it's safe to say everyone has heard.
Yes.
And probably a name that conjures up a lot of different thoughts and feelings and conceptions and misconceptions.
Absolutely.
And as our sources point out, judging Marx by the actions of those who call themselves Marxists
Yeah.
can be a very tricky business.
Oh, yeah.
Kind of like judging, the essence of Jesus by only looking at,
History.
the history of Christianity.
Like Christianity. Exactly.
Yeah, so we need to kind of separate the man from the myth, so to speak.
Yeah. The man from the movement, for sure.
So he's a tiring figure in the history of thought. And in some ways, he really represents the culmination
Of the Enlightenment.
yeah, of a certain kind of enlightenment trajectory of thought.
Yeah.
And, you can kind of picture this intellectual chain starting with, Kant,
Right.
moving through Hegel, these just incredible minds grappling with some of the most fundamental questions about how we understand reality itself.
Exactly.
And Marx comes along and says, okay,
and Feuerbach, too.
okay, yes, Feuerbach. We can't leave out Feuerbach.
Can't leave out Feuerbach.
So just to refresh our listeners,
Right.
what was Feuerbach's kind of key contribution here?
Well, Feuerbach basically flips Hegel on his head, right? Hegel's this idealist.
Right.
The idea is that the material world is a reflection of a spiritual or ideal realm.
Okay.
And Feuerbach comes along and says, no, it's the other way around.
Got it.
Our ideas about God, our ideas about spirituality
Yeah.
are actually projections of our own human nature.
Okay.
Our desires, our needs made abstract, and this is a crucial step that really influences Marx.
So instead of these abstract ideas driving history,
Yeah.
we have actual human beings
Yeah.
in our very specific material circumstances.
Material conditions, absolutely.
Yeah, who are at the center of the story, collectively shaping the world around us. That's right.
I mean, that is a fundamental shift in perspective, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
And so that's really what we're here to do today, to really dig into Marx's core ideas, his influences, and try to understand why his work continues to resonate even today, especially when we're trying to understand the structure of societies and how they function.
And how they change.
Exactly how they change, how they evolve, how they, break down and reconstitute themselves.
Right. How revolution happens.
Exactly. And we want to do this without getting bogged down in the often very polarized and politicized debates that tend to swirl around his name.
Right.
Right. We're really interested in the ideas themselves.
The ideas themselves.
And their impact and influence on the world.
Yeah.
And we'll be drawing from a range of different sources today that cover his life, his major writings, and how those ideas have been interpreted and how they've evolved over time.
Yeah, it's going to be great.
All right, so let's get right into it.
Let's do it.
Now, the idea of socialism itself didn't originate with Marx, did it?
Our sources mentioned that there were quite a few other thinkers who were already kind of exploring similar ideas.
Oh, yeah, for sure. There were these early socialists like
Right.
Robert Owen,
Yeah.
Henri de Saint-Simon.
Right.
They were already grappling with these questions of inequality
Yeah.
and exploring alternative societal models.
So what did Marx bring to the table then?
Well, he brought this synthesis, this way of taking these disparate ideas and weaving them into what he believed was a much more rigorous and historically grounded theory of social change.
Okay.
And that's where you get the Communist Manifesto, right?
Uh-huh.
1848, which he co-authored with Engels.
Yeah.
That was a pivotal moment. It laid out their analysis of history,
Okay.
their vision for the future, and then later Das Kapital,
Right.
which starting in 1867 really provided a much more detailed and comprehensive critique of capitalism as a system.
Yeah. So let's talk about Marx himself then.
Okay.
He actually comes from a background that I think might surprise some people.
Oh, yeah.
It was a bourgeois upbringing.
Very much so.
Yeah.
He was born in Trier in what is now Germany.
Right.
His parents were Jewish, but his father, who was a lawyer, actually converted to Lutheranism.
Interesting.
And this wasn't necessarily due to a deep change in faith.
Right.
It was a very pragmatic decision, right, to maintain his professional standing
Yeah.
in a society where being Jewish could be a significant barrier.
Right.
I mean, it just gives you a sense of the social context of the time.
Okay.
And then, interestingly enough, through his marriage to Jenny von Westphalen, he also had connections to the aristocracy. Her brother was a baron.
Really?
Yeah, so he's got these connections to both the bourgeoisie
How?
and the aristocracy.
Interesting.
But despite these connections, his life was marked by considerable hardship.
Yeah, the sources paint a pretty grim picture at times.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
Right.
there's a particularly poignant quote from his wife, Jenny, where she's writing to Engels expressing her wish to be in the safety of the grave with her children. And that just really hits home the level of desperation they were experiencing, right? Poverty, poor health, and the loss of several of their children in infancy. I mean, it's just heart-wrenching.
Yeah, you mentioned 7 children, only 3 survived.
Yeah, only 3 survived to adulthood.
Wow.
So, we're talking about a family that's really struggling just to get by.
Yeah, and so he goes to university, first to Bonn, then to Berlin, and it sounds like these were periods of just intense intellectual ferment for him.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he initially enrolled to study law at the University of Bonn,
Right.
but he was quickly drawn to poetry
Really?
and a rather unconventional lifestyle.
Okay, so not exactly your typical law student.
No, not at all. And then when he moved to the University of Berlin, his intellectual interests deepened significantly. He
Right.
becomes deeply involved with the young Hegelians,
Right.
which was this group of thinkers who were very critical of Hegel's more conservative views
Okay.
on the state and established religion.
So Hegel himself wasn't radical enough for these guys.
No, not radical enough for the young Hegelians.
Right.
And here's where it gets really interesting.
Right.
He later encounters Schelling.
Okay.
And the context here is really fascinating. The Prussian king was getting a little bit worried about the potentially radical implications of Hegelian thought.
Oh, so it's interesting how these abstract philosophical ideas can actually have real-world political consequences.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And so he brings in Schelling to offer this counter perspective to Hegel.
Interesting.
So imagine being a student in Berlin at that time in a lecture hall with Marx, Engels, Kierkegaard, Bakunin all listening to Schelling trying to refute Hegel.
I mean, that's just an incredible concentration of intellectual firepower in one place.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a remarkable moment, where you see the early sparks of so many different and really powerful intellectual movements.
Yeah, and it's clear that those university experiences grappling with these huge philosophical ideas and witnessing these intellectual battles firsthand really shaped Marx's own thinking. And it also paved the way for his crucial partnership with Friedrich Engels, which I think is really central to understanding his entire body of work.
Oh, absolutely. It was a truly pivotal partnership. I mean, they first met briefly in 1842,
Okay.
but their collaboration really took off after they met again in Paris in 1844.
Right.
And Engels was indispensable to Marx in so many ways.
Oh, okay. How so?
Well, first of all, he provided the essential financial support
Right.
that allowed Marx to really dedicate himself to his writing. I mean, Engels was often working in his father's textile factory in Manchester, a job that he reportedly loathed.
Oh, wow.
But he did it to support Marx in their work.
So he was really committed to their shared intellectual project.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And beyond the financial support, he also had a real knack for clear and accessible writing, which really complemented Marx's more academic and sometimes very dense prose.
Right, because Marx is not exactly known for being an easy read.
No, not always.
Right.
And, it's important to remember that after Marx's death, it was Engels who took on the monumental task of editing and publishing volumes 2 and 3 of Das Kapital from Marx's notes.
Right, because Das Kapital was this massive multi-volume work that Marx never actually finished in his lifetime.
Exactly.
And Engels was really the one who brought those later volumes to the world.
Absolutely. He was a true intellectual partner and a real champion of Marx's work.
And he had his firsthand insight into the brutal realities of early industrial capitalism, didn't he?
He did. His book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, published in 1845, was just this incredibly powerful and really damning account of the system. He details the widespread poverty, the horrific conditions of child labor, and the environmental devastation that he was witnessing in Manchester.
Wow. I mean, just to hear you describe those conditions, it's hard to imagine what it must have been like to live through that.
Absolutely. It was a truly brutal period, and this direct experience that Engels had really profoundly influenced Marx's own analysis of capitalism.
Okay, so with that rich background established, let's actually delve into some of Marx's core concepts now.
Okay, sounds good.
We'll start with the dialectical method.
All right.
Now, this obviously has its roots in Hegel, but Marx adapted it for his own purposes, right?
He did. Hegel's dialectic was this process of understanding how ideas and history progress through the interplay of these opposing forces.
Okay.
You have a thesis, you have an antithesis that contradicts it, and then you have a synthesis that emerges from that conflict, resolving the tension at a higher level.
So it's a way of understanding change and development.
Exactly. And Marx, while acknowledging his intellectual debt to Hegel,
Right.
He even considered himself a student of Hegel, fundamentally disagreed with Hegel's idealism.
Okay.
This idea that reality is ultimately rooted in mind or spirit.
Right. So for Hegel, it was ideas that were driving history.
Right.
And Marx wanted to kind of turn that on its head.
Right. Exactly. He famously said that he turned Hegel's dialectic right side up again.
I love that quote.
Right.
Okay, so he's taking this dialectical method,
Yeah.
but instead of applying it to the realm of ideas,
Right.
he's applying it to the material world.
A material world, exactly.
And that leads us directly to the materialist conception of history, which is often referred to as historical materialism.
Right.
This sounds like a real cornerstone of his entire way of thinking.
It really is. It's the foundation in the Communist Manifesto. Marx and Engels famously declared that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles.
Right.
And this is the essence of historical materialism, right? The belief that the economic structure of society, the way goods are produced and distributed, the relationships between different social classes based on their control of these means of production is the fundamental foundation that shapes everything else.
Everything else.
Everything else. I mean, our laws, our
Right.
political systems,
Our culture even.
our culture, our beliefs, our whole superstructure.
It's all determined by this economic base.
It's all ultimately determined by that economic base.
That's a really radical claim, isn't it?
It is, and it's important to note that the manifesto also laid out that quite radical 10-step plan for creating a communist state, which included things like the abolition of private property and the centralization of credit in the hands of the state.
Wow. Wow, yeah, so this wasn't just some abstract theoretical exercise.
No.
He had very concrete ideas about how he wanted to transform society.
Absolutely.
Okay, so then there's his very well-known critique of religion, often summarized by the phrase, religion is the opium of the people.
Right.
And I think this is a quote that's very frequently taken out of its original context.
Oh, for sure.
So can you give us a little bit more of the nuance there?
Yeah, so in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, Marx argues that religion serves a dual purpose. On the one hand, it's an expression of genuine suffering.
Okay.
He calls it the sigh of the oppressed creature.
Right.
It provides solace
Yeah.
in a harsh and unjust world. But on the other hand, he saw it as a form of illusion,
Right.
a kind of escapism offering a false sense of happiness
Yep.
in an inverted world, a world where true human potential is stifled.
Right.
So when he says it's the opium of the people, he means it acts like a drug, dulling the pain of real oppression, but also preventing people from recognizing and challenging the root causes of their suffering.
Right. So it's not that he's saying that all religious belief is inherently bad or wrong.
Right.
He's trying to understand the social function of religion.
Exactly. The social function
Okay.
of religion and how it can be used to both comfort and control people.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so another key concept that feels surprisingly relevant even in our very modern world is this idea of alienation.
Right.
Can you kind of break down what Marx meant by alienation in the context of a capitalist economy?
Yeah, so Marx identified several interconnected ways in which workers become alienated under capitalism.
Okay.
First, they're alienated from the product of their labor.
Okay.
The things that they create don't belong to them. They belong to the capitalists.
Right.
And they're often used to further the capitalist's interests, sometimes even against the worker's own interests.
Right.
Second, they're alienated from the act of labor itself.
Okay.
Instead of being this fulfilling and creative expression of human potential, work becomes this forced, repetitive, and often dehumanizing activity.
Right.
It's just a means to an end survival.
Okay.
Third, and this is a really important one, they're alienated from their species being.
Species B.
Species being. This is Marx's idea that what fundamentally makes us human is our capacity for conscious, creative, and social labor.
Right.
Think of our inherent drive to work together to build things,
Yeah.
both materially and intellectually.
Yeah, we're creators.
We're creators, we're builders, we're collaborators.
Right.
And capitalism, in his view, strips away this essential aspect of our humanity.
Right.
By reducing work to this mere means of survival.
Right. So we're no longer working because it's fulfilling or because it's an expression of our creativity. We're working because we have to.
Because we have to pay the bills.
Yeah, to survive.
Exactly.
Okay. And then the final kind of dimension of alienation is this idea that workers are alienated from each other.
Right. So instead of fostering cooperation
Yeah.
and solidarity, capitalism breeds competition among workers for jobs and resources,
Okay.
leading to these very fractured social relationships. And as Marx wrote in the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844, he says, The man is a species being because he treats himself as the actual living species. Capitalism, in his analysis, fundamentally undermines this.
Wow. Okay, so this is a really powerful critique of the way that capitalism structures our relationships with ourselves,
Right.
with our work, and with each other.
Exactly.
Yeah, and even today, I think we can see how those themes of alienation are still very much present
Oh,
in
absolutely.
our modern world.
Yeah, I mean, think about, the rise of automation.
Right.
The gig economy.
Right. People feeling increasingly disconnected
Disconnect.
from their work, from their communities.
Exactly.
Yeah, so those ideas are still very much alive, I think.
Very much so.
Okay, so how does the concept of surplus value fit into this whole picture?
Right.
It sounds like this is the very engine that drives the capitalist system, according to Marx.
It is. So in Das Kapital, Marx delves deep into this core mechanism of capitalism's surplus value.
Okay.
And his argument is that workers produce more value in their labor than they receive in wages.
Okay.
The surplus value is appropriated by the capitalist as profit.
Okay.
It's essentially the unpaid labor of the worker that becomes the source of the capitalist's wealth
Right.
and the ongoing accumulation of capital.
Right, so the capitalist is essentially getting something for nothing,
In a way, yes.
where the worker is producing more value than they're being compensated for.
Exactly. And as our source McClellan describes, workers are typically paid just enough to ensure their subsistence, to
Right.
keep them alive and able to work,
Right.
but the actual value they create far exceeds their wages. And the capitalist pockets this difference.
Okay, so it's fascinating to see how all of these concepts are really interconnected in Marx's analysis.
It is, they all fit together in this really coherent critique of the capitalist system.
Yeah, and one of the really important points that our source makes is this distinction between Marx's own intellectual approach
Right.
and what later became known as Marxism.
Yeah, Marxism.
Yeah, it really cautions against just simply equating the two.
Yeah, this is a crucial distinction. I mean, Marx's own methodology was fundamentally dialectical.
Right.
It was open-ended, constantly questioning, evolving.
But-
He provided a framework for analyzing the world,
Yeah.
but he didn't intend for his ideas to become this rigid, unchanging dogma.
Okay.
The very process of thesis, antithesis, synthesis implies this continuous dynamism.
Right, it's not a static system, it's a system that's always in motion.
Always in motion, always evolving.
Yeah.
And the source makes this really powerful parallel with the teachings of Christ
Yeah.
and the later development of Christianity. The original message, often nuanced and open to interpretation,
Right.
becomes codified into doctrines,
Right.
institutions that sometimes stray very far from the initial spirit.
Yeah.
Similarly, the Marxism that developed in various political movements, particularly in the Soviet Union under Stalin, became this really rigid and often brutal ideology that Marx himself would likely have vehemently opposed.
Right. Our source even suggests that a figure like Stalin probably would have had Marx eliminated
Yeah,
if he had been alive in 20th century Russia,
exactly.
which is a pretty stark reminder of how ideas can be twisted and misused.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it really highlights how Marx's theories were adapted and sometimes drastically distorted as they spread across the globe.
Right.
And Mao Zedong and Chinese communism are a really key example of this.
No, for sure.
Mao adapted Marxism to the very specific conditions of China,
Right.
which was very different from the industrialized European nations that Marx had primarily focused on.
Exactly. China was largely an agrarian society. And Mao's revolution drew its primary strength not from the urban working class, but from the peasantry.
Okay, so that's already a significant departure from Marx's own analysis.
It is.
Right.
And his quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong,
Yeah.
often known as the Little Red Book, became incredibly influential.
Yeah, the Little Red Book. I mean, what a phenomena.
Oh, absolutely. Offering these seemingly definitive answers
Right.
to a wide range of political and social questions.
Right. It's interesting, the contrast between the kind of open-ended questioning spirit of Marx himself
Yeah.
versus the kind of very programmatic answers
Right.
that you find in the Little Red Book.
Exactly. And just to give you a sense of the scale of this adaptation, while the Communist Manifesto has sold tens of millions of copies, the Little Red Book reached an estimated nearly 800 million.
Wow, that's just an astounding number.
It is.
And the source doesn't shy away from the tragic consequences of these adaptations by figures like Mao and Lenin. Drawing this really sobering parallel to the atrocities committed by Hitler's regime.
Yeah. It's a difficult but necessary point to confront.
Yeah.
The implementation of these adapted versions of Marxism in the 20th century
Yeah,
led to the establishment of totalitarian regimes responsible for immense human suffering and loss of life.
right.
And it serves as this really powerful and tragic illustration of how even seemingly progressive ideas can be perverted and used to justify terrible acts.
Right. So ideas have consequences, and sometimes those consequences can be unintended and very, very negative.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so Marx's intellectual legacy isn't solely defined by these authoritarian interpretations,
Right.
particularly in Western Europe.
Right.
Our source points to a significant resurgence of interest in his ideas after World War II.
Oh, for sure. In the post-war intellectual landscape, particularly in France,
Okay.
Marxist-inspired theories filled a significant philosophical void.
Okay.
Many prominent existentialist thinkers, for example, were deeply influenced by Marx's analysis of alienation and the human condition.
Okay, so you have this kind of interesting intersection between Marxism
Yeah.
and existentialism.
Existentialism.
Okay, yeah. And this period also saw the rise of what's often referred to as Western Marxism.
Right. Western Marxism.
Yeah, which was this really diverse body of thinkers
Yeah.
who engaged critically and creatively with Marx's ideas, often in direct contrast to the more dogmatic interpretations that were prevalent in the Eastern Bloc.
Right. So it's a much more nuanced
Or more new
and
one.
less ideologically driven engagement with Marxist thought.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So who are some of the key figures in this Western Marxist tradition?
Well, you've got figures like George Lukács
Yeah.
with his seminal work, History and Class Consciousness.
Okay.
He really emphasized the more dialectical and philosophical dimensions of Marx's thought, focusing on concepts like class consciousness and reification.
Okay. And what about Antonio Gramsci? He seems like a really central figure.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Antonio Gramsci, an Italian Marxist,
Yeah.
developed this hugely influential concept of hegemony.
Hegemony. Right. Hegemony. Yeah. And he argued that dominant social classes maintain their power not just through force
Right.
and economic control,
Yeah.
but also through cultural dominance.
Yeah.
By shaping the prevailing ideas, values, and beliefs of society in a way that makes their rule seem natural and inevitable.
Right. So it's not just about brute force. It's about controlling the narrative.
Controlling the narrative, exactly.
Yeah. And the anecdote about Mussolini's regime imprisoning Gramsci and the prosecutor's demand to stop his brain from working for 20 years really underscores the perceived threat
Right.
of his intellectual contributions.
Yeah. He was seen as a very dangerous thinker.
Yeah, and his prison notebooks, which
Yeah.
were written during his incarceration
Right.
and published posthumously, remain incredibly influential in fields like cultural studies and sociology.
Absolutely.
And then we also saw figures like Louis Althusser in France,
Right.
who spearheaded these structural Marxism movement,
Yeah.
trying to synthesize Marxist thought with structuralist linguistics and anthropology.
Exactly. So you have all these different strands of Marxist thought developing in the West.
Right. It's a really rich and diverse intellectual landscape.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So even after the collapse of the Soviet Union
Right.
and the apparent decline of kind of orthodox communist movements, Marx's ideas haven't simply disappeared.
No, they haven't.
Our source makes a really strong case for his enduring relevance.
Yeah, I mean, Marx was arguably the most dominant intellectual force in 20th century academia.
Wow.
And his impact on global political and social movements is undeniable. I mean, the Cold War itself is a prime example of his influence shaping world events.
Right.
But even after the fall of the Berlin Wall, his work continues to resonate. It's really telling that the global financial crisis of 2008 led many economists and social scientists to revisit Marx's analysis of capitalism
Right.
in an attempt to understand the roots of such systemic failures.
Yeah, because suddenly it seemed like Marx's critique of capitalism was looking a lot more relevant.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And our source suggests that as the inherent contradictions within capitalism continue to manifest in the 21st century,
Yeah.
Marx will likely remain a vital and insightful theorist for understanding our world.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like his ideas are more relevant now than ever.
In many ways, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so to bring it all together, we've journeyed through Marx's intellectual origins, explored his foundational concepts like historical materialism, alienation, surplus value.
Right.
And we've examined the complex and often very contradictory legacy of his thought as it's been interpreted and applied across different historical and cultural contexts.
We've really covered a lot of ground.
We have. It's been quite a journey.
It has.
And, I think one of the key takeaways for me is just how much Marx's framework for understanding history through the lens of class struggle
Yeah.
and his really powerful critique of the inner workings of capitalism continue to spark debate.
Oh, absolutely.
and offer really valuable insights into the social and economic structures that shape our lives.
They're essential tools for understanding the world around us.
Yeah, and so that brings us to our thought-provoking question for you to consider.
Right.
Marx famously wrote, "It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness."
Wow. Yeah, that's a powerful one.
Yeah, I mean, take a moment to really reflect on that in your own life.
Right.
How might your own thoughts, beliefs,
Yeah.
and even your sense of identity be shaped by your social and economic circumstances?
It's a deep question.
It is, yeah. And how might this relate to his other really powerful call to action? The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Workers of the world unite.
Yeah, and just for a final, perhaps slightly tongue-in-cheek observation.
Okay.
One commentator famously quipped that Karl Marx might have been right about socialism working, but he was perhaps focused on the wrong species.
Okay, what does that mean?
The underlying idea here is that maybe human nature with its inherent drives related to individual success. And the well-being of close kin might present some fundamental challenges to purely collectivist ideals.
Okay.
It invites us to consider how our understanding of human behavior, perhaps informed by evolutionary biology, might impact the practical viability of socialist or communist systems as envisioned by Marx and his followers.
So it's almost like a biological critique of Marxism?
In a way, yes.
Right.
It's a different angle to consider as you continue to explore these ideas.
Yeah, it's really fascinating food for thought.
It is.
Well, this has been an absolutely fascinating deep dive into the world of Karl Marx.
It has been.
Thank you so much for joining us on this intellectual journey.
My pleasure.
And until next time, happy reading.
Keep thinking critically.
All right, take care.
See ya. Bye.
Bye.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.